Hello and welcome to From the North. Well, the current coronavirus pandemic is affecting all of our lives and sport is no different. Most events are cancelled and the football season is suspended. But at a time where some clubs are already on the brink of financial collapse, will the impact of the virus now put them out of business? What can and will football do to make sure all clubs are protected? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined by Mark Palios, who's the owner of Tranmere Rovers, Paul Stanley, who is a financial expert, and Natalie, Burrell, who is a Manchester United YouTuber. Guys, thank you so much for joining us today. Mark, we'll come to you first of all. I mean, just put this into context for us. How big a threat is this to football and football clubs?
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking in terms of certainly the lower league clubs in the EFL, League 1 and 2 clubs, I mean, I've looked at what I think the issue would be in terms of the size of the hole that would impact on clubs between now and, say, the end of the summer. If you just say that's when the leagues would start again, and that's a difficult thing, you don't know when they're going to start again. And my estimate is there's a problem that feels around about a 50 million hole in the cash flow of those clubs. And if you overlay that on the financial sort of landscape of lower league football, Leagues 1 and 2, you've already seen the fact that there's been a lot of situations where clubs have not been able to pay the wages on an ongoing basis with paying gates, etc. So, and administration, and we lost Bury Football Club. So, it doesn't take a blind man to see that, in fact, what we actually have here is clubs living hand to mouth. And if I say they're living hand to mouth and you suddenly take away 50 million out of that scenario, you can see it's a serious problem.
So when you say 50 million, we're talking about League 1 and 2 clubs. You're probably thinking about, that's about £1 million per club.
Yeah. £1 million per club. And some clubs may be slightly less, some clubs slightly more. You overlay on top of a situation whereby you've got very little flexibility in terms of managing your cash flow, because a lot of your outgoings in this particular case are inelastic. They're players' wages, and some of these players actually probably aren't storing away great sums like they are in the Premier League. So they do actually have mortgages and families to look after. So that's not going to be an area whereby you can actually carve something out of your cash flow. So in whatever way you look at it, cash has to come into that scenario for clubs to survive, or things have to happen. You might have to have insolvencies, etc. I have talked a little bit about insolvencies without sporting sanction, because what's happening now is something that's not necessarily, if you like, financial mismanagement. It's a consequence of a global pandemic.
Well, I suppose a lot of people will be looking at the finances within football and saying football's awash with cash. There's billions of pounds there right at the top of the game. Can big clubs in the Premier League, are they in a position to be helping the Football League clubs at a time which is unprecedented for everyone?
Big picture, what you say is exactly right, David. I think the problem is that when the Premier League first set out in 1992, they had the opportunity then to have a fairer split of money, and each time there's been a change, there's been a de-emphasis on the lower league clubs and a bigger emphasis on the Premier League. The Premier League chairman, they will argue exactly the same as the things that Mark's arguing, not just on with bigger numbers. Every football club, from what I can see, pretty much always runs itself on a cash neutral basis, as well as it can. There's a playing budget that the manager gets to spend on players and transfers, and that number goes up if you have a great cup run or you sell a player, and it goes down if you get relegated, and the budget moves according to the size of the club. It would be highly unusual, I think, for a club at the top of the Premier League who had an extra 20 million in the budget for a manager not to be just spending it. So I don't think there are bank accounts awash with money that's not accounted for. In the long term, of course, you could take a portion of that money and move it lower down the league, which personally I think would be a better way of dealing with things. There needs to be certainly not a level playing field, because the lower league players aren't at the same calibre as the Premier League players. But what we all like as football fans is got a match on a Saturday, whether it's Man United, Man City, Stockport County, Tranmere Rovers. We all want to go to a game, and if the whole game's been threatened, something big picture needs to happen. And that will mean not necessarily individual clubs helping out, but the Premier League as a global brand supporting the football family, of which I think of the 92 clubs, around between 50 and 60 at different times have been in the Premier League. It's more than half.
Natalie, obviously you support Manchester United. You're one of those big club supporters. Would you be happy if your club put millions of pounds into the lower league rather than spending it on a signing?
I think with the times that we're in now, we're going to have to definitely support these lower league teams. I think if you lose the lower league, so if all League One and League Two teams just say went into insolvency, there's no point just having a league. It would wipe out League Two, League One. This is how it works. This is the football pyramid. We're all in this together now as a football family. It's not just about Man United being able to spend X amount of millions. We need to help out everyone in the whole pyramid.
So Mark, for you, what happens? Do you go cap in hand to those big clubs, or do you go cap in hand to the government? Where do you go? You say clubs need £1 million each. Where do you go for that?
Well, I think that there are a few things, and for me, the first thing is there has to be a unified approach, because whether you like it or not, if the government has a pot of cash that it will give out to SMEs, to small, and a lot of the football clubs that we're talking about in the leagues 1 and 2 of the pyramid qualify for that. So, but if we go out cap in hand to the government, we're probably going to be close to the back of the queue, I suspect, because people aren't going to be sympathetic. They're going to associate with Man Uniteds of this world and think that it's all there. So I think there's a couple of things. One is that the leagues have to be united in what they do, both in terms of the way they change the context by liaising with UEFA and stuff like that. We show a united front on that. You bring the PFA in as well. Then when you go to government, you go with a bit of self-help attached in there. So some of that self-help may be money coming down from the Premier League and so forth. I know people have argued possibly from some of the television companies, but they're already fighting with the Premier League in case the Premier League don't finish the season. But we get a united front on that. We go with a bit of self-help. And therefore you can get some possibly from the government, you can get some from the football itself. But when I say self-help, there's a couple of other areas as well. One is in terms of the general way in which football clubs carry themselves going forward into the future. And two is looking at what I think is the cancer in the game, which is player wages. And I'm speaking as an ex-player and ex-PFA ref, not just as a chairman and owner and ex-FA and all that. But, so I actually think there's an opportunity now to put some conditionality around whatever support you give. So if you are giving loans to a club, because I've talked about a 50 million hole, and whether that's right or wrong, it could be 40 million, it could be 60 million. And that will take us, I think, roughly into the area whereby, you're getting out of the summer and into the autumn. So what happens when you go beyond the autumn? You don't actually want to be back in the old situation where, I've just said before, the landscape is such that they can't actually manage from a day-to-day basis, because you're still seeing clubs going into administration, you're seeing players not being paid, etc. So there's an opportunity to link into that some simple controls over wages, for example, and I think the simpler the better in the short term. Just put a cap in the leagues. Just start with that. It
would be good to see, say, a player like Pogba or Rashford or Lingard, young English lads maybe helping out a team like Tranmere who pay, with a player, with a player's wages, because I'm sure that they're getting paid X amount a week. I'm sure that a bit of that money would help Tranmere survive, Bolton survive, local northwest clubs surviving. And so if a player like Rashford or Lingard could help, that would be good. And then maybe the Premier League would help in other ways. This is what we need to do. We need to unite together, really. I think.
Realistically, do we really see that happening? In an ideal world, yeah, that would be great. We're talking about this, but do any of us realistically think that's going to happen?
I don't think so. I think it's a bit unfair, to be honest. If a top Premier League player who's aged 20 has got a 10-year career and he can earn well in any profession, my profession, your profession, if you get a great gig on the radio, on the TV, and you get a big pay rise, and then somebody turns around to you and says, "There's a guy in hospital radio not earning enough. Can you chip some of your wages in?" It's not your problem, and I think it'd be a bit unfair to expect. There might be generous people out there who might make gestures, I think, and it would be fantastic if they did, but I think it'd be wrong to make that the sort of solution to the problem. I think the problem's far bigger than one man making a gesture.
Well, just tell us that.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think it's the principle, and you're talking about really that principle, and I agree with you that it's difficult to see individuals breaking away from that and making a difference. I think it's more about, looking at the way in which the money comes down through the pyramid and the solidarity in the pyramid. So, for example, there are structural flaws in it. So we get a percentage of an absolute sum, being an accountant now. So you get a percentage of an absolute sum from the television monies. Now, that percentage stays in place, but actually, if the absolute sum gets bigger, the gap gets bigger. Because you get 10% of £100, you get 10 quid. If you get 10% of 120, you get 12, but somebody else gets the rest, the other 90%. So that gap gets bigger. So there are things like that are structurally in the system. And if you can change the things like that, because ultimately, coronavirus aside, it's about the gaps in the pyramid that cause the problems, because the beauty of the pyramid is you've got ambition, you can go up right and you can end up playing right at the top, but people then start to try and jump those gaps, so you do things to stop those gaps. So what you're talking about, I think, is that's about an individual, and yes, if we can get everybody thinking the same way, it is more important to me that we structurally change the game rather than look for individuals to change it on their own.
It's the same for everybody. The principle of it, rather than an individual making the choice, the principle is that the clubs will spend what they've got. So if you give the top clubs an extra 80 million TV money, they will all, as we've seen with the Premier League clubs, daft salaries going out, daft transfer fees for very average players just to play in a squad on the off chance that the two internationals before them get injured, because why risk it if the money's in the bank? If you took that 80 million off them and gave them 60 million, there wouldn't be any change. All that would happen is you would have to then pay every player slightly less, and if every club's in the same boat, you wouldn't get a situation where a Sanchez is getting 300 grand a week because the club that you're competing against wouldn't be offering 295. There would be a limit where somebody else would go. And that throughout the whole pyramid it would apply. So if you take a little bit out of the top and put it down slightly lower, admitting that it's a business all as well, I personally think that the difference has gone far too much. I've just reread David Conn's book, The Beautiful Game, which from memory was about 15 years ago, and I'm just on the last chapter now. And the issues then are exactly the same as now. Bury had just had a financial crisis. There were clubs going into administration. There was the Football League and the FA were at loggerheads on how money should be split. The Premier League was getting too much money, even though it was a fraction of what they get now. So the basic problems have been the same, and in a lot of ways the problems have got worse because the chairman of the bigger clubs they're not all football men. Most of them these days are finance men. And I'm an accountant, Mark's an accountant. You look at things on spreadsheets, you look at numbers, and you do.
Not an accountant, are you?
No.
Natalie's not. But you look at things. You've got a job to do, which is to maximise your income, and that's what you do. And then you spend the income. And if you can get Sanchez by paying more, if you're Man United than Man City were offering, then that's what you do. But if the amount that both clubs have got is less, it's all relative. The bigger clubs, whatever you do, will always be able to afford the better players. They always have done. They always will do. There's never been a player move from a lower league to a higher league for a pay cut or no transfer fee. It's always been there. It's just that the differential now between the amount of transfer fees paid at the top level and the wages paid and those paid in slightly lower divisions is huge, and sometimes the quality of player ain't that much different.
So say football does nothing and just sits on its hands and just goes, OK, it'll sort itself out. I mean, what are we talking, Paul? How many clubs, are at a real threat and risk of kind of...
What, at the minute?
I
would say pretty much all of them.
Right.
Apart from the ones apart from my Premier League club, Man City, who have got owners that probably will put money in. United won't have long-term problems. Liverpool won't have long-term problems. But all the clubs at the bottom end of the Premier League, who are already struggling with the threat of relegation, all the clubs in the Championship and down to the non-leagues, none of them, because they all live hand to mouth, as Mark said, will be able to afford the wages. And they cannot pay the VAT, they cannot pay the PAYE, they cannot pay the local suppliers, because it's unlikely, I think, that government will be putting winding up positions into struggling businesses. But the actual wages need paying at the end of the month, and if you don't pay the people who your employees, and this is not just football, this is every business, then you can't carry on.
Well, it's funny talking about wages. Do you see, Mark, any kind of thought or insight into players, staff accepting
Any what, sorry?
Staff or players taking wage cuts, reduced wages for now, just to help the clubs for time being? Do you think that would happen? Or?
Well, just putting my sort of turnaround hat on, if I'm managing a cash flow crisis, then you have a whole myriad of things that you would do. One of those is to look. So at the moment, the real task for football at the moment, and I'd like to ask you something about season tickets as well at some stage, if I may get that in.
Absolutely.
Because I have a view where fans are, and we were talking about the coronavirus crisis. So if you're actually looking at the football club at this point in time, the issue is we have uncertain circumstances which we've got to plan against. So one of the things I'm saying to the EFL is, yes, we've got a short-term funding crisis, and what's the size of the hole? The second is, within the context of trying to get certainty as regards the virus, the impact when we start the leagues, when we don't, get as much certainty as you can as soon as you can. Because once you've got certainty, you can then plan against it. That's the issue. And in the meantime, what you're trying to do is to cut your cloth so you can live within your cash resources as long as possible. And while you're doing that, when you're sort of doing all the things you do around a cash crisis, you try not to destroy the fabric of the business. It's exactly the same for any other business out there as it is for a football club. So what I mean by that, in terms of, you talk to me about potentially people taking wage cuts. Our first cut at this is to look at our staff, because our biggest cost is our staff, and it's inflexible because these are people who aren't getting paid a massive amount of wages. What Barnet have done, have looked at their staff, that they're contractually tied into the players at this point in time, and that's pretty inelastic. So we looked at our staff. We tried to, it's a phrase that I shouldn't use because I hate it, is repurposed them. We've tried to realign them to do things. So for example, the maintenance staff will be doing stuff that they would be doing in the closed season, and they've actually been doing that now as a consequence. So you look where possible to repurpose your staff, refocus your staff. You look to make staff take their holidays now rather than taking them, storing them up and taking them in the summer when they've normally taken, or pay in lieu of notice and stuff like that. And that's the first stage you go to with your staff if you're trying to keep them in place. Then you'd be looking at redundancies potentially, or the alternative to redundancies is say to somebody, look, would you like to take and renegotiate their salary and take a pay cut now, and so forth and so on. So it's a stepwise process, at least that's what we're doing, before you actually see redundancies. But the sooner we can get certainty into the situation, we can then plan properly.
I'll let you ask Natalie the question now. Then you had a question about season tickets.
So you say what you're going to say, and I'd like to ask you on season tickets.
I know you were saying taking pay cuts, and it's wrong to ask Rashford or wrong to ask these players to give their money up. But it's like you're saying, for me, Alexis Sanchez getting paid $300,000 a week when teams like Tranmere are struggling. As a fan, and yes, I'm looking at it as that passionate kind of person, I don't think it's right, and I'm sure a lot of people out there in the public wouldn't think it's right. But yeah, any questions about season tickets? Man United are still asking for the season ticket money on the set deadline date, even regardless of when we're going to start back. They want next season's money by the 1st of May. So a lot of fans that probably are in less paid jobs than the players that they are getting paid, just at 9 to 5, and a lot of people are having to go off with, self-isolate, are still having to find 700 plus to be able to watch their team next year. It's
a big ask, isn't it? Like you say, they're wanting commitment for next season, but you just don't know when the next season is.
And that's it. That's why, when as soon as we had this issue whereby it was definitely going to go across the summer, that's why I said, well, okay, now look at the cash flow of clubs, because you can't take for granted that season ticket money coming in now for us. That starts to fund us through that period lower down in the leagues when you haven't get people coming through the gates. Now, if I was to ask our fans for that, and we do ask them for it, and our supporters trust drive our season ticket programme. So there's this tension. We're looking at it and saying, well, actually, we totally understand that the people we're asking to contribute in terms of their season tickets, to make commitments, and some of them have been great, in terms of refunds. I'd rather the club had the money, and that's okay because that's gone. But you can imagine the debate. And I'm not being sexist, but you go in and you talk to your wife and say, look, by the way, we'd actually like to put our money, 400 quid or whatever it is, into a season ticket, and this might be your last payday coming up at the end of this week, and so you can't actually guarantee the season ticket monies are going to come in. And I would say, at best they'll come in later on, again out of this window again. So that's another impact, and that's why the cash hole suddenly jumps up another 500,000 for us. And if you multiply that out, that's where you get your 50 million from.
I think with the difference maybe between Manchester United, they know that fans will always. I'm not saying that your fans aren't as loyal, but they've got 100, they've got millions. They've said, they talk about the waiting list.
There's a real market for those tickets. So I know that people have. They don't know who the original name on the ticket is, but they've been season ticket holders. So I understand that. Yeah.
So with that, I think that's why they can sort of say, well, you're under threat of losing it, and that threat is real. Whereas maybe other places, they need the money now more so than Man United need it.
We're talking about also the pay as you go. I've got season ticket at City, home and away one, and I've got a season ticket at Stockport as well. So when City don't play, I do Stockport home and away. And I would always buy my county season ticket because they need it, a lot more. I could see though, the whole point of a season ticket at City, at United, at Liverpool, it's a guarantee that I get my seat every week. At Stockport, I could turn up and pay on the gate. And if my job was under threat, and I might have to make that difficult decision, then I think there's a lot of fans going to say, do you know what, I won't buy a season ticket, but what I will do, I'll still go next season, but I'll go and pay on the gate. And it might cost me a bit more, but actually this season just gone, I ended up paying more for a season ticket than the guys who paid on the gate, because a quarter of the games disappeared. And
a lot of questions. There's
a lot of questions there.
That's a lot of questions they're putting on people. I mean, this is the men's game we've talked about. Natalie, I know you're a massive fan of the women's game as well, and it's really going through a boom period at the moment. How is this kind of shutdown and suspension of the women's game going to affect it in this country as well?
The women's game, a lot of teams are part-time, so a lot of girls, female players don't get paid. Staff that you talk of, they'll be relying on the men's team to be bringing in money for them to get paid. So I can see a lot of women's teams maybe closing down, definitely affecting that pyramid in terms of, the National League there, the Championship. WSL, it should be okay, but, Liverpool women, you could say that they're not really getting a lot of support from their men's team, even though their men's team are top of the Premier League. So why would, with the gates there, a lot of people can pay on the gates there, so there won't be any they'll be really cash to mouth. So with the women's team, there's also talk of the Europa 2021 being moved back, and that then has an impact on the women's European Cup competition, which was supposed to be here in England, an opening game at Old Trafford. That's not looking like it's happening. Everyone's focusing on the men's game, but there's more people that are going to be at risk here.
Absolutely, this is affecting men, women, not just football as well, is it? It is all sports. Mark, Natalie, Paul, thank you so much for your time today. Well, there we go. No football is being played at the moment, but, well, as we've just been discussing, there is still plenty at stake in these unprecedented times. Thanks for joining us.